So let's begin by noting that we pretty much completed the ready stage for this networking opportunity, but because we're also teaching people how to do things, let's go ahead and finish up by doing our QARGs. And after we finish up this educational jaunt into the ready mode, note that the whole reason why we're doing this in the first place is to understand what needs to be done so we can estimate what it will take to convert to the networking opportunity. In other words, we've seen the code. We know how that's going to work. We see it every time we run it in the classic mode. What we might not have understood is what it would take to start up a client and a server. Then for the rest of our lives, now that we understand what's going on, we don't have to go so deep into the ready mode. And of course, now you can add another X to your 1X, 2X, or 3X engineering status, because you know it can be done. And more importantly, you can test our client and server on other machines once we finish up this demonstration. Of course, the ability to test things on the other machines is why we didn't like the zero protocol. If we're looking for a network address, of course, we should probably want to do more. For example, to know what our server address is on our client. Keep in mind, we're not a UDP client. So we could simply create an F string and then F out to intercept our server mode before changing directories to our new PyTrack directory. Simply to make things easier to see on our stream and also to put things back on my backup path. Bring up our server this time in another location. Let's go ahead and run our project to see that we are now showing that indeed we're coming back from the loopback port. Obviously, our server port address of 9000, which will work a lot better than a dotted quadded 0 at port 9000, certainly if we're located somewhere else. But even this won't work if we're on another machine. So we see that we have several different ways of looking at our IP address, even from our own machine, where we're obviously running on the loopback port, or perhaps on another network where we would need to have our full address, as we'll demonstrate next. So our mission, of course, is to replace the get sock name and the 0th position of that, which wasn't doing anything very useful for us. So we can listen on our UDP port, now renamed, all hosts. And once we bind that address, we can see what port we're listening on. And we know, of course, that we're going to get our client port and the client IP address from our tuple. So let me show you another way to get a server IP address that relies on a much more reliable mechanism that requires us to first get the name of our host or host name, and that's always a problem. We had to have a hosts file, and we look in that host file to get a IP address associated with our machine. And this doesn't come from the DNS registry in the world. The host name can come from a larger registry, but also can come from our own host file or local registration as well. In other words, that socket name is simply an alias to an IP address that we can use when we do something, for example, like get our host by name, as we see here. So now we're going to want to include both our host name, wherever that came from, as well as our server IP, which of course would have simply been something that was looked up by our supporting Python encapsulations, which isn't necessarily the same support we have in the operating system. What is important, of course, is that we do have a host name and an IP address associated with it that didn't come from our network layer, but came more from our support system associated with our socket. Running our module, we pretty much see what we expect to see and have always seen, and copying our file location to get to our new project location will give us a real nice listing of our IP address, as well as our local network DNS name, which is, of course, the name of my computer. And I've changed both my IP address as well as my name so as to protect the innocent. Now, this is a pretty expensive call, or certainly could be, because I've never seen an IP address change. And though while it's not out of the realm of possibility to have a host name or an IP server change, while we're executing, I haven't seen it happen in any civilian equipment yet. So let's go ahead and move this socket IP query, which is easy enough and inexpensive enough in a loop to have our get host by name as well as our get host name occur after we've bound, which is not a bad place, to our socket. Giving the protocol enough time and to ensure that we have a connection good enough to find our infrastructure, host name, and IP address, no matter where it comes from. So our main mission of our last activity was simply to quark it up. And going up one more block as we first enter in our run, of course, the first thing we want to do is see, as we're probably familiar with and easy enough to understand, if our host tag was in quarks. And if not, then we're going to create a host tag to obviously contain our all hosts. Same thing will happen for our port. If port is not in quarks, then we're going to go ahead and set that to our default port. And that was easy enough to do. And for the sake of consistency, obviously we now need to change out our manifest constants. Putting constants in quotes is probably not a bad idea. So as to update all of our displays, give a pretty good rendition of what we need to see in order to get our host name and our server IP back from our server. Running our client, of course, we do see that everything worked as we expected, of course, with our names changed to protect the innocent. For the server, at least, all is well. Copying and pasting what we see here again is going to be a crime from our server to our client. And since our all host hasn't been imported, just our loopback, we can keep our UDP port, but obviously our host needs to be changed and respected, as well as our quarks port. Keeping in mind we have our server being echoed back from our packet information, and our defaults are now respected. Putting our server, of course, and switching over to our client. Here again we see that all is well.